Hello and welcome to part 2 of drugs and doping in sport. So in the previous screencast we had a look at the first objectives that aren't highlighted, are focused. In this screencast then is to have a look at the consequences of taking performance enhancing drugs or doping on society, also the performers that choose to take these performance enhancing drugs, what are the consequences for them. Finally, we're going to have a look at the strategies used to stop the use of illegal drugs and doping. Okay, we'll have a real look at the evaluation as to whether that's successful or not. Okay, so let's have a start off then. First things first, let's get into the consequences of doping on the performer and society. Let's start with the performer. Now, in the previous screencast and in lessons, we've had a look at this idea of a particular sporting individual who is being synonymous with the use of illegal performance enhancing drugs. That's Lance Armstrong. So what we're going to do is use him as our concrete example and then look at some other examples of sports performers in a lesson. So if I started off from here then, let's have a look. What are the consequences for someone such as Lance Armstrong taking performance enhancing drugs? Now the first thing that will happen is, like in the sport of cycling, they will lose certain sponsors, but so will the individual performers. So for example, he might lose his sponsorship with Oakley. They might reduce that sponsorship as the one we used before with that. It might be Nike would remove their sponsorship of Lance Armstrong. So that's an example of how that sponsorship can go. Now, if we go down from here, the other thing we need to consider is health implications. So if I said to you from here, if you are an individual performer who chooses to take illegal performance enhancing drugs, you're doing so in the knowledge that you could have some negative health implications. Now, there are lots of health implications, as you will know or become familiar with when you do the exercise physiology aspect of the course. But certainly, if I give one example here, there are certain performance-enhancing drugs that have side effects of cancer. Now, Lance Armstrong had cancer, testicular cancer. Now, obviously, this could happen to absolutely anyone, but he himself attributed the reason that he thinks he got testicular cancer was due to the fact he took a illegal performance enhancing drug called human growth hormone. Human growth hormone has side effects of growing cancerous cells at a faster rate than they would have if you didn't take it. So if I sit down to here, I put Lance Armstrong cancer as one example there, just so you can link that to. If you want to put down in brackets there, this is not definite, this is him saying this in an interview that he thinks when he took human growth hormone, it was at that period after that he developed cancer. So from there, that's something to put in from there. Final thing to have a look at then is bans. So if I put onto here, one of the big implications for a performer taking performance enhancing drugs is that you could get bans. And I put onto here, Lance Armstrong received a lifetime ban from cycling when he was caught taking performance enhancing drugs. Okay, so they are three really important consequences of doping or taking illegal performance enhancing drugs on the performer that takes them. Now on top of that, let's have a look at society. So society, what are the consequences for the people who live in society, maybe linked to liking cycling? Let's have a look. First up, basically, there's a really important thing here, that if this idea of doping and performance-enhancing drugs is linked to a win-at-all-costs ethic within sport, but it also promotes this idea of a win-at-all-costs society. So what we're saying here is that, if people in society see sports people doing anything to win, in this win-at-all-costs ethic, or win ethic, then society might consider this to reflect them. So they might think that they could do anything to be successful. For example, you look at things such as, let's say, I don't know, in certain jobs, you might think that you would do anything, go against any rules in order to be successful. For example, stockbrokers, for example, might do things they shouldn't be doing in financial markets in order to make profit. So that could be an example there. On top of this, the other thing within society is that elite sports performers taking illegal performance of the drugs leads to negative role modelling. Okay, so what this might mean is that young people might be encouraged to take performance-enhancing drugs such as anabolic steroids as a result of seeing elite sports performers such as Lance Armstrong taking them. Now, the final thing I want to look at from a societal point of view is that once we've had these things here, so we're saying that negative role modelling, some people might take performance-enhancing drugs because they've seen their role models do it. Okay. On top of that, it's really important to know that there are some performance-enhancing drugs that transcend, move across from being illegal in sport, but also being illegal in society. So if I said from here, some performance enhancing drugs are against the law of the land. So, for example, I put into here cycling was synonymous with amphetamines, which would be known on the street name as speed, I suppose. So if you go from here and say amphetamines, if you are caught taking amphetamines in sport, you will be banned. If you're caught with amphetamines in society, that goes against the law of the land and that is illegal, so you could go to court, you could potentially have prison sentences or punishments for that. Okay, so I think that is something to be really consider when we're talking about society. So there are key things. Make sure you've got good notes differentiating between the impact of doping on the performer who decides to take it and the people who live in society, and again linked to doping there. All right, so let's move on from here then. So what we're going to look at is as follows. Now, doping happens. Okay, we don't always know how much until a few years after. Okay, but doping is happening in every sporting event that we watch. Okay, there's a good chance of it across a season, for example. So what we need to know then, what are the strategies that can be used to prevent doping? And what's important, I've left this up here, we then are going to have a look at why these strategies have not worked in terms of preventing doping happening. So firstly, and I'll put this here so you can make your notes accordingly, let's start off then. What strategies are used to prevent doping in sport? Well, the first thing that's been done to start us off before we look at strategies is that in 1999 there was the creation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, and they are the worldwide organisation that coordinate the fight against doping in sport. So these are the idea that they're trying to make sport fairer, they're trying to make sport safer. Okay, so this is something that happens here, and they work with UK Anti-Doping Association, for example, to try and eradicate drugs in sport. So that's our start bit. That's the first thing that was done to try and prevent doping in sport. Moving on from there, the biggest way we could stop the use of performance-enhancing drugs is by lifetime bans. Okay, so if I said that, Lance Armstrong had a lifetime ban for cycling for systemic doping over a long period of time. So if I went from here, these lifetime bans are there to act as a deterrent to stop people from taking performance-enhancing drugs. Next thing, what's other strategies? Now, the biggest way to stop people from taking performance-enhancing drugs is to test them regularly. So what I'm going to do is give you 3 versions of testing that could help prevent doping in sport. The first one you might have heard of, but you might not know the name. It's known as the Adams Initiative. And the Adams Initiative is really quite interesting. It basically proposes that an athlete, if you sign up to professional sport, to organisations, they will say that you have to give your whereabouts, you have to agree to be tested both in and out of competition. Okay, and you have to give your whereabouts to drug testers 2 hours of every single day of the year. Okay, so if an athlete goes on holiday, they have to give their location for 2 hours of every single day of their holiday, the hotel name, the time that they're going to be there, so drug testers can go there and randomly test them if they need to. So I'll put it down into here, in terms of description, tested in and out of competition, know an athlete's whereabouts for 2 hours a day, 24/7/365. Okay, so that's a really, really good way of athletes being monitored in terms of what performance enhancing they might be taking. On top of that, we have retrospective testing. So when an athlete has finished a competition, they will store their urine and blood in World Anti-Doping Agency labs, and this means that once the event is finished, testers can go back 1, 2, 5, 10 years later and retest those blood and urine samples to see if there are any new performance-enhancing drugs that were not testable back then. So that's something that can be used, retrospective testing, and I'll put that little description there. So from here, the last way that we can test, or the testing procedure, is something linked directly to cycling, and it's called a biological passport. A biological passport, basically, a cyclist will have, like we have a passport to be able to go to another country on holiday, to go to certain cycling events, you have a biological passport which will store your physiological value. And specifically, it's looking at things such as your hemoglobin count or your red blood cell count. And if your red blood cell goes above a certain threshold, it would suggest that this is above the normal range. If it's above the normal range, it would suggest that you might be having a drug that is linked to red blood cell production, such as EPO or blood doping. Okay, so that'll be looking at that, and I'll put a little example in there. So there are tested. The other way or strategy that can prevent doping is to try and eradicate it before it happens. So this can be done via education. So the specific drugs education initiative called 100% Me. So 100% Me basically is an initiative that basically says, right, athletes should know that they are 100% me. That means that they know every single thing that goes in their body, they know what it is, and they know whether it's illegal or not. So they're educated in this, they do programs. If you're in any elite sports sector, you are given this training to make sure that you know what is in your body is legal. Okay. The final thing then for us to have a look at with regard to strategy to prevent doping in sport is something called counterculture. Now, counterculture has a really interesting, because it says rather than trying to prevent doping, why don't we just let everyone do it? And this is a really radical approach that basically says rather than going against what we want to do, let's just go with it. So we basically have something like this. Counterculture, well, we could put that dash a drug Olympics. Basically says allow all athletes doping to compete in a separate Olympics that is just linked to people on performance-enhancing drugs. Now, these are the strategies. So in that case, nobody takes performance-enhancing drugs. But as we know, they do. Okay, so they still do take it. So why have these strategies not worked? And what I'm going to try and do is hook on reasons why they haven't worked to the strategies that were created to try and prevent doping in the first place. World Antidoping Association, or agency, was set up. But the big problem is that sport is based around an ethic or a philosophy, and it is win at all costs. So basically, the reason why you can set up the World Antidoping Association, but to evaluate that, we have a win at all costs nature within sport. Okay, therefore, it's really difficult to make that strategy, the strategies that we've said work. On top of that, we have lifetime bans to act as a deterrent to doping. But we will know there are certain organisations that athletes can appeal to, as you'll know from 21st century Britain. So what we have then, although we have lifetime bans to act as a deterrent to doping, the problem is we have something called the Court for Arbitration in Sport, and often they will overturn life bans. An example of this was a British sprinter called Dwayne Chambers, who got a life ban, overturned it, and then got it put down to 2 to 4 years. I can't remember the exact date. On top of that, we have things such as the Adams Initiative. Brilliant initiative, tested in and out of competition, knowing athletes' whereabouts for 2 hours a day, 24/7. But the problem with this is, within that initiative and within this testing in and out of competition, an athlete can miss 3 tests. So if they can miss 3 tests, this gives them enough opportunity to get the drugs out of their system. So first thing that's an issue is athletes can miss 3 tests. The other issue is in countries, there are some countries such as Russia that have been found guilty of state-sponsored doping. The government are sponsoring and paying for the doping. So it's all very well knowing that you have, testing in and out of competition, testing people randomly. But if the government are the ones who are involved in it, they will help make sure that these samples are hidden. So I'll put into here that downside to this is that you can also have state-sponsored doping such as Russia. Now, retrospective testing, a brilliant way to catch athletes who have taken drugs. Let's say, for example, in 2012 London Olympic Games, people take drugs, okay, but they weren't caught. They're stored in a lab, okay, and then they are tested retrospectively. So maybe in 2020, a new drug comes onto the system, into the society, and then the drug testers will go back and test, and they will then reduce or redact those people who won the medals, and everything from there. So if I said down to here, but the problem with this is that cheated athletes lose sponsorship and they have delayed medals. Now, this is obviously a real issue. So, although it's great that you can eventually catch the people, okay, that are responsible for it, if someone's career has already finished, they've lost all the sponsorship, all the prize money, and that medal does not mean the same 10 years after the event. So that's one of the reasons why, this strategy doesn't always work that well. So going on from here then, biological passports, if we have a look at this, they're great to test for abnormalities, but there are some undetectable drugs, such as THG, which is an example of designer steroid in the 1990s, that basically it's almost like the technology to create new performance-enhancing drugs is ahead of the testers. Okay, so it's relevant having a biological passport if the biological passport doesn't know what it's testing for. So you might just add to this bit here, technology to create new performance-enhancing drugs is ahead of the testers. Okay, education, there's no evaluation of that. Obviously, I'm hoping people can see here that although counterculture is a radical approach for thinking to counter drugs by thinking, well, there's no point, we basically just let the people who want to do it. Obviously, there are huge health and moral implications of that. So the health risks, there are moral and ethical implications of letting people take performance enhancing drugs.